here on YouTube Live to give every last one of you who have subscribed to my channel or who have viewed the live streams that I have conducted to include video posts here on YouTube. This past week, I have went live here on YouTube on Friday to be specific. And during the course of the live stream, my broadcast was terminated erroneously. The first message that I got with regards to the termination of my live video from someone employed here at YouTube was that the content that I was presenting was from another content creator, when that content creator was myself. Subsequent to receiving that message, when I went to an email that was sent to me by a member of YouTube, that email explained that my live stream was terminated as a result of me showing firearms in the live stream. I found that to be discriminatory due to the reason that so many other content creators that I have seen, which whom I actually subscribe to, have held firearms during live streams, and their live stream was never terminated prematurely. So I sent a member or employees of YouTube a letter dealing with the act that to have penalized me as a result of doing what other people are currently doing or have done in the past here on YouTube is an act of discrimination, which is in violation of the Civil Rights Act, and that I would like for my access to live streaming to be reinstated, which it was, as you all can see now that I'm here actually conducting this particular live stream. But I was also under the impression too that perhaps the live stream was prematurely terminated because of me utilizing my knowledge of law to educate the vast majority of the American population to the fact of us being permitted to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights. And in so doing, or invoking that specific right, we also have a right to self-defense, civil defense, and of course, the right of revolution. And I felt that it was imperative for me to convey specific information to the general population here in the United States of America as it relates to those two specific freedoms because of what has been going on here in the country in recent months. Now I was looking at Jasmine Crockett, who is a congresswoman here in the United States of America, speaking about what we as individuals can expect here in America, or what we should expect because of what Donald Trump has recently did or has instructed members of the armed forces to do with regards to attacking the people of the country of Iran. But what Jasmine Crockett didn't say is what she needed to say, or what I felt she should have said. And that is, if we have so-called sleeper cells here in America who has been awoken to retaliate against other American citizens, which could be you and I, even though we may not have had anything to do with what Donald Trump has done, and I can personally vouch for me not having anything to do with that nonsense. But those people don't know that because here in America, we as people in general always thrive on the notion of democracy under a Republican form of government, meaning under a democracy, it is we, the people, the constituency, the civilians who presumably has power and authority over those whom we have elected to positions of public trust. And when those individuals whom we have elected or appointed to public office does things to people in other countries, those people, based upon us living in a democratic nation, assumes that we, the people, have instructed our civil servants to do the very thing that our civil servants have done, in which we did not agree with. So, naturally, because we are considered the weaker of the vessels here in the United States, people tend to attack us more. And what I mean by that is this: we have a Second Amendment liberty to keep and bear arms under the Bill of Rights. But so many of us Americans have allowed those in civil service to create statutory provisions, judicial precedents, rules, regulations, and policies that impedes upon our right to access and carry and utilize certain firearms that we feel is necessary to possess for our own personal protection and the protection of our family and friends. And because we have allowed those incompetent bozos in civil service to usurp their privileged authority that we have given them under the Constitution when infringing upon that specific freedom, the right to keep and bear arms, which is equated with the right of self defense, we have put ourselves at a disadvantage, not only from enemies that are foreign, but also enemies here in America that are domestic. And those domesticated enemies here in America are comprised of those employed within the legislative branch, the executive branch, or the judicial branches of our national government or a centralized government of a state. And that is why I emphasize the importance of every last one of us knowing enough about the law to where we can overcome those specific obstacles in which our civil servants have put in our way to keep us bound to the point to where we are not in a adequate position that is required to protect ourselves from uh, lawlessness, civilians, whether those civilians reside here in America or they come over here from other countries, to include those within governmental institutions, whether American governmental institutions or foreign governmental institutions. So, with that being said, what I was conveying on the live stream this past Friday before it was prematurely terminated was that I have studied law for over 2 decades. So I have a vast array of knowledge when it comes to law and politics, law or knowledge of law that many of you are unaware of, which I was unaware of until I got deep into the studies that I was conducting with regards to law. But like for instance, when we talk about the right to keep and bear arms, and when I say that members of Congress has no authority under the Constitution to make laws restricting our access to possess firearms, that is not just a bald statement that I make, because one of the things that I like doing as a litigator, as an individual who has studied law and politics for as long as I have, is to inform everyone of what the actual law specifically says to where there will be no misconception as to what it is that I'm conveying to you. So, in studying law, I would say maybe 8 years into my legal studies, I happened to come across a case known as United States versus Cruikshank. The citation number to that case is 92 US 542 23 LED 588. And this particular judicial decision was rendered in the year of 1876. On page 553 to that specific judicial opinion, Chief Justice Waite, in writing for the majority, stated, and I quote, "The Second Amendment declares that it shall not be infringed, but this, as has been seen, means no more than that it shall not be infringed by Congress. This is not a right granted by the Constitution, neither is it in any manner dependent upon that instrument for its existence. This is one of the amendments that has no other effect than to restrict the powers of the national government." End quote. Now, the reason why Chief Justice Waite, amongst the other associate justices for the Supreme Court of the United States, stated that that amendment was only to be applied to the national government, such as the President for the United States, Supreme Court judges, federal court judges, whether they be in the district court setting or the appellate court uh, um, segment, to include, as it stated, members of Congress, right, which are the national legislators. So, with that being said, we have to understand the meaning of what those words, when we talk about keep and bear and infringe, means. And you know, when you look at the Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary on page 637 to the 10th edition, the definition of keep is, and I quote, "to refrain from revealing," end quote. So when we look at the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights that specifically says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, when we look at keep as depicted under the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights, it is clear that we as individuals already have the liberty to conceal the weapons, the arms that we own. So we do not need any concealed handgun permits for the Bill of Rights, or should I say more specifically, the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights specifically authorizes each and every last one of us to conceal the weapons, the arms that we actually own. So we already have that right. We don't have to pay members in civil service additional funds just to get their permission to invoke rights that our ancestors have already fought for in blood, sweat, and tears. And that is a problem because so many Americans have become so afraid of those cowards in civil service that it's putting us, as I stated earlier, at a disadvantage to where we are not in a position to fully and adequately protect ourselves from enemies, both foreign and domestic. Now, when you look at the word bear under the same dictionary on page 99, the word bear is defined as, and I quote, "to carry or possess arms," end quote. So, clearly, the right to keep and bear arms, or the right to bear arms, means that we have a right to openly carry those firearms on our person while out in public if we so choose to do so. So, we don't need any statutory provisions. We don't need any permission from those idiots in civil service to exercise the right that we have to openly carry as well as to conceal carry the firearms that we own. Now, when we look at the definition of infringe as defined in the same dictionary on page 599, the definition of infringe is, and I quote, "to encroach upon in any way," or let me rephrase that, "to encroach upon in a way that violates law or the rights of another," end quote. Now, we all know that The Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights is considered under Article 6 to the Constitution for the United States of America, the supreme law of the land. That means that the Bill of Rights supersedes any statutory provision that is ratified by a member of Congress or some state legislator. It supersedes any executive order issued by a president for the United States of America or a governor in the several states of the United States of America. It also applies to any national legislator, as we all know, which are members of Congress, to include any state legislators who are employed within the General Assembly of a respective state that makes up this nation. So, in saying that, or in knowing that, it is clear, y'all, that every freaking gun law that has ever existed here in this country is indeed unconstitutional. Because like the judges in the Supreme Court said, members of Congress has no authority under the Constitution to make laws restricting our access to firearms. And when they say our access to firearms, the Second Amendment doesn't differentiate between whether one of us has had a prior felony or misdemeanor conviction or not. It doesn't differentiate between whether those offenses were nonviolent or violent. It doesn't differentiate between that, because when you look at the Cruikshank decision, Cruikshank, along with many other people, literally murdered unarmed African Americans, to include, I believe, Native Americans, in broad daylight with guns. But Cruikshank's decision, well, his conviction got overturned because, like the judges in that particular opinion said, the Second Amendment is not a right granted by the Constitution. Neither is it in any manner dependent upon the Constitution for its existence, which means that the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights predated the Constitution. And because members of Congress, to include presidents, governors, judges, get their authority under the Constitution, that is the reason why they have no power to enforce laws, to enact laws, or to apply laws that disregards the content of the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights. But getting back to what I was saying, the reason why the judges in the Supreme Court stated that the Second Amendment only applied to members of Congress was because back in the day, the judges were under the erroneous perception or presumption that the Second Amendment did not apply to those within the state governments. And that particular fact can be found in the case of McDonald versus City of Chicago on page 754, when the judges stated, and I quote, "The Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment, originally applied only to the federal government," end quote. That is the reason why in the Cruikshank decision, the judges were under the impression that the Second Amendment only applied to the national government or members of the national government, such as I stated earlier, members of Congress, the president, the attorney general, the Supreme Court judges, the circuit court judges, the United States District Court judges, and so forth and so on. However, in the year of 2010, when the McDonald versus City of Chicago decision came out, the judges had a change of position on that matter. And now they are, or were under the impression that the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights also applied to members of a state government. And that specific fact can be found under the McDonald decision on page 750, when the judges of that particular court stated, and I quote, "We have previously held that most of the provisions of the Bill of Rights apply with full force to both the federal government and the states. Applying the standard that is well established in our case law, we hold that the Second Amendment right is fully applicable to the states. End quote. Now, when the judges made the Second Amendment fully applicable to every state in this nation, to include New York and Washington, D.C., and every other state, even though state legislators, governors, and judges do not honor the supreme law of the land to the extent that they should be, only because the judges in the Supreme Court, they don't hold these people in contempt of court like they would do an individual like you and I, because they are afraid of people like that, because these people have a means of fighting back, and that means is the invocation of their right to keep and bear arms. That's the key, y'all. The key is arms. If you have arms, you can resist. And if you can resist, people don't want to perish from this earth. So they're going to be more respectful to the people who have the arms and the people who are unafraid of using those arms. But moving forward. Now, when the McDonald decision came out, it made what the judges said in the Cruikshank opinion applicable to the state legislators, meaning because members of Congress had no authority to make laws restricting our access to firearms. So, too, after the McDonald decision was rendered, state legislators had no authority to enact laws restricting our access to firearms. So, now we know that without a law, a police officer has nothing to enforce. And if a police officer has nothing to enforce, judges have no law to apply to a specific situation, which means that a judge under those conditions lacks subject matter jurisdiction to proceed in a court of law with a specific case, especially when the law in question is unconstitutional. And in Marbury versus Madison, the judges of the Supreme Court stated that if a law is void, it is unenforceable. And these are things that we all need to know about. And many people say, well, many people ask me, which was the basis of the live stream, it was for all of my brothers and sisters who have been previously convicted of a felony or specific misdemeanor offense. Many of you are wondering, does the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights apply to you with regards to the right of keeping and bearing arms? And based upon my legal research, which is what I just stated earlier, the answer to that question is yes. It always has been. It's just that that specific portion of law has not been enforced to the extent that it was initially designed to be enforced. Okay? Now, with regards to that, a lot of people feel that the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to people with prior felony or misdemeanor convictions. Many people are under the erroneous presumption that once an individual has been convicted of a certain felony or misdemeanor conviction, that that individual no longer has a civil liberty to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights. But that is not what the judges say about that specific issue pertaining to people with prior felony or certain misdemeanor convictions. And I found that in the case of United States versus Whitmire, it was a federal court case rendered out of the Fifth Circuit United States Court of Appeals in the year of 1979. And on page 1319 to that specific judicial decision, the judges of the Fifth Circuit United States Court of Appeals said, and I quote, "The essence of the Bill of Rights is the protection even of wrongdoers," end quote. Now, what happens when an individual commits a felony or misdemeanor offense? They're considered wrongdoers, lawbreakers, right? And so once a person has been penalized for the offenses that he or she has been convicted of, We all know, whether those in civil service, to include other civilians, want to acknowledge it or not, that once a man or woman has been discharged from a federal or state penal institution after being convicted of a specific felony or misdemeanor offense, that we cannot continuously penalize people for what they have been already penalized for in the past. We all know that to do that is an act of discrimination. And we all know that to discriminate against someone is in violation of the Civil Rights Act, which is a federal law. Okay? Now, we also know that to penalize somebody for what they have already been penalized for is also an act of double jeopardy, because one cannot be subjected to the deprivation of life, liberty, or limb for the same offense twice under the Fifth Amendment to the Bill of Rights. We know that. So when people do that, when we as the constituency allow those in civil service to create laws, and when we um, acknowledge those laws through issuing true bills of indictments against people under those circumstances, or um, finding people guilty of specific offenses under those specific circumstances, we are in essence in violation of the law. Now, just because we're not being penalized for violating the law doesn't mean that we're not in breach of the law. And that's what many of you have to come to the realization of. And I know some of you may be thinking, well, um, Okang, that is a case out of the Fifth Circuit United States Court of Appeals. It doesn't apply to every other state, because it only applies to certain states because of the judges in the Fifth Circuit's jurisdiction. But let me tell you something. There's also a case out of the Supreme Court for the United States of America known as Bell versus Maryland. And on page 328 to that specific decision, Associate Justice Black stated, and I quote, "The worst citizen, no less than the best, is entitled to equal protection of the laws of his state and of his nation," end quote. You see, the worst and the best citizens are entitled to the same laws, the same freedoms in the state that they reside in, to include the United States of America as a whole. And that Supreme Court precedent applies across the board. And even if it didn't, y'all, we know We know that the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution for the United States of America, to include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is considered the supreme law of the land under Article 6 to the Constitution for the United States of America, we know, whether those in civil service want to acknowledge it or not, that those freedoms apply to every one of us here in the United States of America, to include other countries, when we're talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It also applies to us too, because that is a national and international document, or legal document, so to say, because it was ratified in conjunction with the United Nations Charter, which is a treaty. And we know that under Article 6 to the Constitution for the United States of America, that treaties are considered to be a part of the supreme law of the land here in America. And I'm gonna go ahead and summarize things for you all. Just to make it simple, because that's what I like to do. All right, go back to what I need to go back to. All right, here we go. I'm still in the case of McDonald versus City of Chicago, y'all. On page 768 to that specific judicial opinion, the judges of the Supreme Court acknowledged when they stated, and I quote, The right to keep and bear arms was considered no less fundamental by those who drafted and ratified the Bill of Rights. End quote. You see? Now I'm going to go to page 778 to that same judicial decision, because what the judges are about to say here, it also applies um, to members of the state as well. But I just want to cover every base. But on page 778 to the McDonald decision, the judges of the Supreme Court stated, and I quote, "In sum, it is clear that the framers and ratifiers of the 14th Amendment counted the right to keep and bear arms among those fundamental rights necessary to our system of ordered liberty." End quote. Okay. Now, with that being said, we know that the right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights is considered under American law to be a fundamental right. We got that right. Okay. The right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental right. Here we go. All right. The right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental right. The judges in the Supreme Court have acknowledged that. The Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights substantiates it. So, what does the judges say about fundamental rights being encroached upon by those in civil service? I'm going to tell you. In the case of West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, on page 638 to that specific judicial opinion, which was written in the year of 1943, the judges of the Supreme Court for the United States of America stated, and I quote, "The very purpose of the Bill of Rights was to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and to establish them as legal principles to be applied by the courts. One's right to life, liberty, and property, to free speech, a free press, freedom of worship and assembly, and other fundamental rights may not be submitted to vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections." End quote. Now, what happens when a bill is brought to the floor of a legislative body, whether that legislative body is a member of Congress or some legislative body within the General Assembly of a respective state that makes up this nation? What happens, y'all? A bill is put on the floor by a member of Congress or specific congressional members or legislative members, if we're talking about the General Assembly of a specific state. It's put up on the floor for individuals to vote upon, right? People vote upon those statutes, right? They either say yay or nay. Do they agree or do they disagree? But when gun control laws were put up for vote in a legislative body, this particular judicial decision that I just read, West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, specifically says or entails that every gun law is unconstitutional for the simple reason that the Second Amendment is a fundamental right, and fundamental rights may not be put up to a vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections. But many of you didn't know about these particular judicial decisions. I've heard many content creators here on YouTube who claim that they are lawyers or, just involved in politics. They've never mentioned any of these judicial decisions that I have mentioned before you all here today. And I believe it's because people really don't want change. They want us to keep giving them money. I supported gun Second Amendment advocacy groups. But here's the thing. When they litigate in the court of law, specifically in the Bruin decision, and the Supreme Court judges rule in favor of us, the constituency, and the governor of New York continues to ignore Supreme Court precedent, which they consider their decisions to be case law, right? And nothing happens to her. So what happens now is that these are, same attorneys want us to give them more money to go litigate on account of the governor not following Supreme Court precedent. I mean, come on now. If the precedent has already been established, all that needs to happen at that point is for the precedent to be enforced. Litigating is not the freaking answer. Enforcement is. So if the governor doesn't want to acknowledge Supreme Court precedent, then they need to hold her accountable or hold none of us accountable when we disagree with their precedents. And why would the governor get mad at us? She's disregarding Supreme Court precedent. We disregard whatever law that she signed in association with the legislators. She wants to hold us accountable for us disregarding what she says, but yet she feels that the Supreme Court judges has no authority to hold her accountable when she disregarded what they said. That's not the answer, y'all. That's why I stopped supporting with money. And shoot, I'm gonna be honest. And even with my time, these attorneys that keep litigating the same issue over and over and over again, because we're getting nowhere. I mean, judges rule in our favor. People in civil service don't acknowledge what the judges say. They want to submit some other appeal. Now the judges disagree with whatever they're appealing, which in turn basically invalidates the decision that they made before, because there's no one there to enforce what they're saying, because they are too afraid to ensure that their opinions are enforced. Because like I tell y'all, these judges and legislators, they do not do things to members of the executive branch like they would us civilians, because they rely upon members of the executive branch for their personal protection. And judges do not want to hold police officers and governors accountable, because if they did, it will likely create a gap between them and law enforcement personnel, which in the judge's view, to include legislators, they're going to put themselves and their family and friends more at risk because of the lack of personal protection that they're going to have at their disposal. All this is basic common sense, and it can be confirmed throughout the history of this country if you just look, watch, and accept what it is you find for the truth that it is. And I know many of us have been conditioned through tradition. So just like with me talking about our right to keep and bear arms and how those in civil service has no authority to enact legislation that restricts our access to arms, to enforce any unconstitutional legislation that impedes upon our access to firearms, or to apply any laws that are unconstitutional that infringes upon our access to firearms. Many of you are not going to accept what it is that I have to say, because you all have been conditioned through tradition. It's hard to break a cycle based upon something that you have been believing in so long and feeling that what you have been believing in was the actual truth, when in essence, it never was. But that's not the only judicial decision that supports what I just said about our rights not being usurped by the majority of individuals in this country, whether those individuals are civil servants or civilians. And here's another case. to further substantiate the case that I mentioned before. And this case is Lucas versus 44th General Assembly of the state of Colorado. On pages 736 through 737 to this specific judicial decision, the judges of the Supreme Court for the United States of America stated, and I quote, "A citizen's constitutional rights can hardly be infringed simply because a majority of the people choose that it be," end quote. Now, under the Cruikshank decision, we do know that the Second Amendment is not a constitutional right. However, many people have presumed that the Second Amendment is a constitutional right. So, with that being said, we can surmise from this particular judicial decision that when they say constitutional rights, they are also talking about the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms under the Bill of Rights, which is synonymous with the Constitution for the United States of America. Okay, we have that, right? Now, United States versus Salerno. On the footnote 5 found on page 761 to this specific judicial opinion, the judges of the Supreme Court for the United States of America stated, and I quote, "Our Bill of Rights is contained in a written constitution, one of whose purposes is to protect the rights of the people against infringement by legislators, and its provisions, whatever their origins, are interpreted in relation to those purposes," end quote. You see, it doesn't matter what the origin of legislation is or where it derived from when that legislation encroaches upon our right to keep and bear arms. Now, many acts of legislation was imposed upon us as a result of, let's say, mass shootings, right? So legislators feel that, okay, well, a mass shooting, it justifies the act of restricting people's access to firearms through gun control. But that's not what this decision is saying. They don't have that authority under the Constitution because, like I said, the Bill of Rights are civil rights. They are reserved respectively to us. That means that no member of a state government or a national government has the authority under the Constitution to supersede their jurisdiction to step over into our uh, 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 path to impede upon the freedoms that we have. I don't give a crap what type of justification they think they have. Because, you know, when these police officers were murdering unarmed civilians without just provocation, I've never heard of any civilian, especially a legislator, wanting to create some statutory provisions that restricted police officers' access to certain firearms, to restrict police officers' access to high-capacity magazines, to include certain types of ammunition. Now, many of you may be wondering, okay, if a mass murder shoots up 20 people, kills 20 people, you wonder how's that different from one police officer firing 30 rounds into a single person? 30 rounds were fired, or more than 20. Do you think it's worse? Okay, do you think the lives of 20 people is more valuable than the life of one? Or are all lives equally valuable? To me, all lives are equally valuable. So what the cops do is really just as bad as what civilians have done. It's just that because police officers have a certain occupational title in the society that we live in, many of you civilians, to include civil servants, have given them far greater leeway when they impede upon the rights of the people that is protected by the supreme law of the land, which makes them criminals. But you all harbor these criminals. You harbor these criminal-minded men and women who holds the title of law enforcement officer in America, or military officer or soldier. And that is why there's really no, it appears to many that there is no equal protection of the laws in this country. Not because there isn't, it's because that the people that we put in these specific positions of public trust have failed the American public to the extent to where people truly believe, from what they have told me, that we do not have rights in this country anymore. But the Constitution has remained the same for over 200 years. Just because the provisions of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution for the United States of America, the Bill of Rights, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are not being enforced to the extent that they should be, does not mean, my people, that we do not have rights under those specific documents. Now, the fact of the matter is, when we look at paragraph 2 to the Declaration of Independence, it establishes our right of revolution, meaning we have a right to overthrow any member in civil service associated with a governmental institution when they subject us to acts of abuse, neglect, and tyranny. We have that right, even though these cowards have created statutory provisions that outlaw the right that we have under the supreme law of the land. Now, how can that be? That is why we all have a right to jury nullification as well, y'all. Because when those in civil service overstep their bounds by creating statutory provisions that encroaches upon our civil, constitutional, and human rights, especially the right to overthrow them when they get out of line, we are not bound to listen to that law. We don't have to indict people for going against that statutory provision, because we know that those statutory provisions are not in conformity with the supreme law of the land, which means that what members of Congress and other state legislators have done when they create laws outlawing our right to overthrow the government, right? We do know that those laws are unconstitutional. And we also know that we are not bound to adhere to any unconstitutional provision. Now, with that being said, I'm going to give y'all some legal authority that substantiates that. In the case of Robertson versus Baldwin, on page 297 to this specific Supreme Court precedent, the judges of the Supreme Court stated, and I quote, "No court is bound to enforce, nor is anyone legally bound to obey an act of Congress inconsistent with the Constitution," end quote. That is why we need to know the Constitution. That is why we need to familiarize ourselves with politics, even though those are two issues that many people choose to not get involved in. But the fact of the matter is, we're governed by politics and law, no matter where we are. So if we are unfamiliar with laws and politics, how are we going to be in a position to right the wrongs of those in civil service when they usurp their privileged authority that we have given them, when encroaching upon our civil, constitutional, and human rights that are protected by the supreme law of the land? We have to familiarize ourselves with law. Now, when I was telling y'all just recently, when they created statutes that outlaw our right to overthrow the government, right, with force, violent force, if you want to be technical. When they outlaw through restricting our access to certain arms, firearms, I told you all that we do not have to legally, well, we're not legally bound to adhere to whatever statutory provisions, executive orders, judicial opinions, ATF regulations. We don't have to honor that. And many people say, well, we don't honor that, we'll go to jail. But the fact is, if we invoke our right to jury nullification, none of us will go to jail for invoking freedoms protected by the supreme law of the land. But we first have to understand the Constitution to where we then will start to understand politics. And once we understand them both, we will know that there's nothing to fear when it comes to standing up against those tyrants in civil service. Because, like I said before, police officers, to include, and I'm going to go ahead and say it, military personnel, they are only as tough as the guns that they carry. If you take firearms from police officers and military personnel, they will not be as tough as they have portrayed to us that they are. So when they say firearms is not the answer, I totally disagree. Because their actions dictate otherwise. If firearms did not mean anything, if firearms didn't keep us protected, why the heck is it that they have them? Why the heck is it that members of Congress are surrounded by armed guards who are more armed than we are? They have more sophisticated firepower than we do. And I'm at a loss as to how that is when we the ones put them in positions of public trust when we pay their salaries. How the heck can they tell us that we cannot have certain arms when we have given them permission to have the arms that they have in which they claim we cannot have? I mean, where did we go wrong, people? When I say we, I'm talking about people in general. Because I'm over that. But look, with that being said, the case of ex parte Sibo on pages 376 to 377 to this specific Supreme Court precedent, the judges of the Supreme Court stated, and I quote, "An unconstitutional law is void and is as no law. An offense created by it is not a crime. A conviction under it is not merely erroneous, but is illegal and void and cannot be a legal cause of imprisonment." End quote. You see, based upon this decision alone, if, like for me, for instance, I have a vast knowledge of law and politics, as I indicated earlier. So if I'm called to serve as a member of the grand jury or a petit jury in a criminal trial proceeding, I'm already aware of what the law is. I'm already aware of what judges can and cannot do, what police officers can and cannot do, prosecuting attorneys, what they can and cannot do, defense counsel, what they should be doing and what they should not be doing. I'm aware of that. So it puts me in a greater situation to where I can ensure that checks and balances are implemented when protecting the civil rights of the people from encroachment by those in civil service. And in so doing that, I will be in a position to protect and defend the Constitution from enemies, both foreign and domestic. Law is like a puzzle, y'all. You take bits and pieces of law to create the puzzle that you want people to see. That's how arguments are created in the court of law. That's why you see, for those of you who ever have, you see legal briefs being submitted by attorneys, prosecuting attorneys, and even opinions by judges or magistrates. They always have some form of legal authority in there to substantiate what they said before, to make their point. That's what these cases are for. That's why I utilize them during the course of this live stream when I made certain comments, because I want you all to know about what the law actually says in relation to what I have told you. Because I feel that if the law says this, especially when it's coming from these judges, which many of you put a lot of emphasis on what these judges say as being the law, even though it's not, but for sake of argument, that's just how people feel. So if I'm telling y'all what the judges of these federal courts have said, and I'm quoting it verbatim to where there can be no misconception as to what I'm saying, as to what they have said, I'm hoping that that will resonate with each and every last one of you to the point to where you become more educated on what it is you should and should not be doing, what you should and should not be allowing those in civil service to do to not only yourselves, but to other people. Because you have to understand that united we stand, divided we fall. So we're all on a different playing field. We're never going to win the game. You see? That's why we have to be on one accord. And the beauty about criminal trials is that it only takes one of us to refuse to convict a man or woman. I know many of us are not going to be on the same page, even though I'm hoping that we will eventually be. But you all, things have grown so bad in this country as of today, primarily because of what I said earlier with regards to what Donald Trump has done. And I'm going to go ahead and put members of Congress out there too. Because if they feel that Donald Trump has done something wrong, if he has done something against the Constitution, I don't see why these people are constantly coming on these social media sites under their profiles, complaining to us about what Donald Trump has done and what he has not done. My question and point that I want to make to all of you legislators and governors who have done that, what the heck are you doing to stop Donald Trump from doing what it is he has done in which you claim he should not have done? That's the question. You all are not going to fool me into believing that you have our best interests as civilians at heart, like you're fighting for us. You all are freaking cowards. You talk a good talk, but you're not putting forth no freaking viable action to correct whatever mistake that you feel you have made or people have made during the electoral process. Nothing's stopping you cowards from having a congressional hearing to impeach Donald Trump. The thing is, I believe all you cowards are afraid of Donald Trump. Therefore, you don't want to do that because you're afraid that he might, as you all claim, because he's so unhinged, he's going to do something to you. You all are freaking cowards. You like restricting people's access to arms, the very constituents that support you all. That way, when things like this happen, we're in no position to really protect and defend the Constitution from enemies, both foreign and domestic, because of what you all have led people to believe. You all have led people to believe that we don't have access to certain arms in this country. You all have led people to believe through the bogus statutory provisions that you cowards have created that we don't have a right to self-defense. I've heard many stories where people have invoked their right of self-defense and they still get incarcerated by these freaking police officers. If they invoke their right of self-defense under the same or similar circumstances, it'd be considered a justified shoot. But why the heck is that so different when we civilians are placed under attack and we invoke our right of self-defense? Why the heck is it that so many of us have to go through the judicial process, be incarcerated, spend time away from our families, our jobs, and the moment we get out, you cowards do not want to compensate us as a result of being unlawfully incarcerated or accused for committing crimes that we never committed? I don't like you legislators. Matter of fact, I'm becoming more and more fed up with all you freaking cowards in civil service. You all are not doing what it is we put you in public office to do. Now, I didn't vote, but at the same time, I'm still paying taxes. Paying taxes to fund your salaries for what? And I'm real close to not paying taxes anymore. And I don't give a crap for those of you who think, oh, if you don't pay taxes, you're going to jail. No, I'm not going anywhere. Because like I said, I know what my freaking rights are protected by the supreme law of the land. I don't have to pay them idiots nothing. And that's just like if you own your own business and you hired me as your manager, and I'm not performing the way that you told me that I should perform. You don't have to pay me for that. You don't have to pay me for no work that I did not do. And that same concept should apply to those cowards in civil service, in spite of how fearful a lot of you civilians are of those freaking fools. My point is, y'all, I come on here to try to educate you all on the laws designed to protect your freedoms, specifically the right to keep and bear arms, as that freedom relates to self-defense. Because I know or have reason to believe that what's going to transpire in this country in recent months or days is going to affect you all to a great extent. And the only way to really come out of this unscathed is if we all, and I'm including myself, ignore these dumb laws and get the arms that we feel is required for our own personal protection and defense. Because we cannot rely upon those cowards in civil service to protect us, because they can't even protect us from domesticated enemies in the doggone White House. And you know, Donald Trump is not a freaking fighter. But these soldiers can go overseas and fight trained killers. But when they come back over here, claiming they fight for our freedoms, but yet we got people in civil service creating statutory provisions, rules, executive orders every day that encroaches upon the very freedoms that many of you military personnel claim that you went overseas to fight for. That is a freaking lie. And that is why I too do not respect many of you to the extent that other people do, because you have not fought for my freedoms. Because if you did, I wouldn't be going through a lot of the things that I have been going through. What have you all done? You fight people overseas, you fight foreign enemies, but you are too afraid to fight domesticated enemies? Old people like Donald Trump and Clarence Thomas? I mean, that's an easy freaking target compared to you fighting some trained soldiers overseas. But you all are not afraid of trained soldiers, but you're afraid of cowardly men and women here in America. They're seeing you cowards over there, and I call you cowards because you're afraid to stand up to them on behalf of the American people. And then when we start standing up against them because you military personnel have failed to do so, now they want to instruct you all to come at us. And you expect us just to deal with that. But I'm one of the people that's not afraid of any one of you. And like I said on prior live streams before, many of you military personnel, you are taught hand-to-hand weapons combat by individuals such as myself. And you have to understand that when we teach people, at least me personally, I come up with various other tactics, whether defensive or offensive, that can counter what it is that I showed or taught somebody before. Because I would never have anybody, any student of mine, becoming so good to where they can defeat me by utilizing my own methods that I taught them. Now, I don't want this to happen, y'all, but the facts are the facts. And I'm not talking about all of you military personnel, because some of you have went against the grain. And I stand with you all. But for those of you who harbor fugitives that violate our civil, constitution, and human rights, rights that you all took an oath to protect and defend under the Constitution from enemies both foreign and domestic, I do not respect you. Not to say that you cannot never regain or gain my respect. And shoot, half of you might not even care if I respect you or not. And I feel the same way about you. But just know that the Second Amendment is real. That right does not exist for no reason. And I am fully aware of why that right came into existence. And I'm not afraid to utilize it, especially under the appropriate circumstances. But I would like nothing more than for all of us to get along. But unfortunately, not every one of us is going to get along. So for those of us good people out here, we have to rein the wicked people in and replace them with people like us, which are good people. That's the only way that we're really going to correct this situation that we're in. And many of you may be claiming, oh, it's God's will, but that's the thing about the Bible that many of you don't look at. God always gives us a way out for those of us who listens. But the way out is not believing that we have to obey those in authority over us in governmental positions like Donald Trump. And many of you claim that, but the moment Donald Trump starts doing the things that he's doing that's affecting you, now all of a sudden you want to critique Donald Trump. But why are you people who believe that you have to obey those in governmental positions because God told you to, critiquing Donald Trump or anyone else in civil service for that matter? You believe that, right? So if you're critiquing Donald Trump, then obviously many of you do not even believe in what you claim you believe in when it came to the Bible saying we have to obey those in authority over us. The fact of the matter is, if we put people in civil service, that means that they are subservient to us, which means that they are not in authority over us. Now, what the Bible was referring to is obeying those in authority over us, right? It says, honor your mother and father. Mother and father created us, right? Through procreation. So yeah, we obey those in authority over us, right? Mother and father. Not Donald Trump. Not Governor Gavin Newsom. Not Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court for the United States of America. No. Obey those in authority over us. God put Jesus as the head, right? Over us. So yeah, we obey Jesus, right? That's what the Bible talking about. It doesn't talk about no Donald Trump. God didn't put Donald Trump in that position like he did King David. You all did that. People. So you elect this man, and all of a sudden he has authority over you. How the heck does that make any freaking sense? You all have warped minds. You bend the word of God because you are too afraid to stand on the word of God when it means to encounter some coward in civil service. That's the problem. And many of you claim, oh, I walk down the valley of the shadow of death, I should fear no evil. But yet you fear the evil perpetrated against us every day by those idiots in civil service. But you still cling to the Bible, a freaking book that many of you truly do not even believe in. And then some of you Christian brothers and sisters, you claim, oh, no weapon formed against you shall prosper. But yet you still afraid to go up against another man or woman in civil service because you are afraid of what they will do to you with the weapons that they have at their disposal. You all don't believe in the Bible to the extent that you claim, and that is partly the reason why you all are undergoing unwarranted trials and tribulations in your lives right now as I speak. Yeah, many of you don't want to listen to me. Yeah. Many of you might be looking at me like I'm some incompetent bozo that's on YouTube just to submit erroneous information that's going to get people hurt in, in the society that we live in. But, what baffles me is that many of you who believe in that bogus fallacy, you claim to believe in what the judges of the Supreme Court says amongst other judges and other circuits, whether state or federal. And when I'm quoting what these judges are saying, which is in conformity to the things that I have told you thus far, you all tend to say that I'm crazy, but yet you still acknowledge the judges for being these smart people. How does that make sense? Answer that question for those of you who believe that about myself. You think I'm just online trying to just manipulate you all into doing things that I myself don't even follow? There's many things about me that many of you do not know. And I haven't revealed that to you all yet because I do not yet really know you all. But I had every intention of doing so when the time is ripe. But I can assure you all that everything that I'm telling you is absolutely correct. And I have legal authority to back it up. Now, what people on YouTube has backed up what they have said with actual legal authority. Now, I would love to put this on the screen for you all, but I'm not set up for that right now. I mean, I have the technology to do it, but I'm not set up for that. And I decided to go live without being set up for that because this issue is important to me because it affects us all. And I didn't have time to get set up because this, like I said just a few moments ago, is an important issue that needs to be addressed as promptly as possible. And that is what I'm doing. That is what I have been doing. But I want all you to be safe, though. I want all of us to look out for each other. I want us to invoke our right of jury nullification. I want us to invoke our right of revolution when we need to. And if we don't invoke it, I want us to be ready just in case we have to. I don't want us to be caught with our pants down when stuff really hits the fan. And many of you claim to believe in God, revelations. Get prepared, people. And understand this, God is no coward. Even God's people carried arms. King David carried a sword, probably a bow and arrow, crossbow, dagger. Those are arms, y'all. We just have become more sophisticated in the creation of arms, but it's an arm nonetheless. Get ready, my people. And I will say this, like I've said on other live streams, even though I don't get any responses from you all. But if there's any questions that you have for me based upon the content of this live stream today or any other live stream or post that I have submitted for publication on YouTube, feel free to ask me questions. And I will be sure to get back to each and every last one of you. And for those of you who actually commented in the live stream, Havoc 9, speak to you too, guy. Say hello to you too, Toby M. What's going on? Abby Green, how you doing? Yeah, Toby. Okay, Toby said Abby's chill. Abby Green, Toby, mind your own business. Nah, Abby Green. Okay then, Daddy. Okay, well, I appreciate y'all for coming on though. I'm trying to see if I could follow y'all. Like I said, I'm still new here to an extent as far as figuring out how to do this. But let me see. Chat messages in last year. Oh, that's my little yeah, I can turn that off. Yeah, y'all, but yeah, I'm basically done talking. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on here with the comments. So, like I said, if any one of y'all are on, I have a few moments to answer any questions if anyone of you have any. Because I have to get prepared for work in about 10 minutes. So, you see, I sacrificed a lot to come on here, y'all. I have legal work to do. But I felt this was more important to convey this information to you all based upon what's actually going on in our societies today. And I just want us all to know what rights we have because, believe it or not, even though we have a right of jury nullification, judges do not want us to know about that right when we get to a specific courtroom. That is why it is imperative that we know about our freedoms before we go there. Not after the fact, because after the fact, from my experience, can be a little too late, meaning that you may be able to come out of whatever situation that you have found yourself in, but it's going to take a heck of a lot more in order to accomplish that. That's like me, for instance. And I'll give y'all an example. A few years ago, after coming home from work, because I worked at a organization known as Kickback Jacks. Many of you may be familiar with that establishment. And what I used to do at Kickback, I used to be what they call a floater at times, meaning my primary location was on Battleground Avenue here in Greensboro, North Carolina. But I also went to New Garden in Greensboro, North Carolina to work at that one. And then I go back to Greensboro. I was called to Asheboro at one point, Durham, So yeah, and I actually went to Winston-Salem, North Carolina one time, well, a couple of times. But yeah, just a floater, right? You know, when they need help at another location, I go to that other location when I get off. So on this particular day, you have to understand that um, when I left out the house, or prior to leaving out the house, my mother had warned me to wear my body armor and take the guns that I had, because she saw some suspicious people in a vehicle parked outside of the house, and it looked like they were arguing while looking at the house. So when she opened the door to get a better look, she said that they both saw her and they took off. So she found that to be suspicious based upon her residence being shot up 5 times in the past. So she told me to wear body armor and to carry my guns. But I also kept a gun at home for her just in case she needed it, even though she wasn't familiar with using firearms at that time. But so when I got done with my work, I came home. It was around 12:15 a.m. And I noticed that headlights just mysteriously appeared from behind me. And keep in mind, I always watch my rear view and side view mirrors to determine if I'm being followed, and if so, who am I being followed by. So I pulled up on the side of the road to the house, got out the car with my gun in hand, but I didn't brandish it to the point to where the occupant or occupants of the vehicle could see it, because I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't want to brandish a gun at someone who may have been an innocent party. That's not what I do. So, like about 15 to 20 seconds later, the guy ended up pulling up behind my car and in between one of my neighbor's cars. So the guy told me to go home. At that point, I'm thinking that it's my little brother who had got off work early, who got a ride from one of his friends who were playing a prank on me. So my response to the guy was, "Brother, I am home." So he repeated what he said, "Go home." I said, "Man, quit playing. Go home, man." I said, "Bro, quit playing before you get popped out here." So he was like, "Well, I feel threatened by what you just said." And I'm like, "No, I feel threatened by the way you ran up on me, knowing that my mother's house got shot up 5 times in the past." I said, "Brother, I don't know who you are." So he was like, "Well, I'm with DoorDash. I'm here to make a delivery." Now, when he said that, that kind of made a little sense to me, because my neighbor's porch light was on. And typically they order DoorDash. So I felt at that point that maybe he was telling the truth. So I responded by saying, "Brother, you might want to back up a few houses down where the light is on. My homie typically orders DoorDash, so maybe your delivery belongs there." So he repeated what he said, "Go home." At that time, he's opening the car door, so I whipped the gun up on him, right? And I started approaching cautiously and slowly for two reasons. The first reason was to get a better look at the individual and what was on the inside of the vehicle. The second reason for doing so was to get a better shot if I needed to fire. And at that point, I had a Remington 1858 single action revolver outfitted with a conversion cylinder chambered in 45 Colt rounds. Cowboy action loads to be exact, but I had the type of cowboy action loads that could be utilized for self-defense based upon the velocity that those particular cartridges gave out. So as I'm approaching, this guy ended up firing shots off at me, y'all. So I ended up firing a shot that I didn't know I fired until after I got on the inside of the house and realized that the entire cylinder was depleted. But he's firing shots. He fired first though. And I guess off instinct I just fired, but I didn't know. But he did hit me a few times. Um, 2 rounds in this arm came out the skin, flesh, and hit me in the rib, which is the reason I wish I had the body armor on. In hindsight, uh, and the other rounds went out this arm. Well, yeah, it was 1 round that made two entry and exit wound, but I was able to fire back. And so when law enforcement personnel got there, I went to the hospital, but they did not take my firearms. They left them there, even though they knew that one was depleted. Um, Other factors were involved with that particular encounter that my mother experienced when she left them on the inside of the house, which um, she could have declined, but nevertheless, what was done is done. So they left my firearms there, so forth and so on. So when I got to the hospital, one of the officers had questioned me. They had an officer already on scene to question me. So one of the things that I asked this officer was, were any other vehicles hit? And his response was no, no vehicle was hit, but your neighbor's window was shot into. And he actually hurt his back because he rolled off the couch and hit his back on the table from what he told us. Um, so that concluded the interview once I told the officer what happened, which is what basically I just told you all. And so 30 minutes later, after I was checked out, the officer came back in and he asked me if I had any objection to CSI members going into my vehicle. Now, keep in mind, y'all, I've studied law for over 2 decades. So I'm fully aware of what the Fourth Amendment to the Bill of Rights entails. So I recall him saying earlier that no vehicle was struck by any projectile. So my question in my mind was, okay, why would members of CSI need to go into my vehicle to obtain evidence if no vehicle was struck by any bullets? So I said to the officer, I said, sir, I'm an advocate of the Fourth Amendment to the Bill of Rights, the right not to be subjected to unreasonable searches and seizures. So I have to respectfully decline to allow members of CSI to go through my vehicle. And he said, okay, that's cool. But if I didn't have knowledge of law, y'all, what do y'all think would have happened? Think about that. That's why when I go through these particular experiences, I put the law into these experiences to give each and every last one of you who may be unfamiliar with the law a greater perspective of how the law actually applies and how, when applied properly, it takes us a long way to where our freedoms are actually respected and protected and not encroached upon by those in civil service whom we place there to protect those freedoms from, and I will reiterate, enemies both foreign and domestic. So that's just something that we have to become aware of. Yeah. Well, with that being said, y'all, I'm about to end. I just did a screenshot of the comment section so I can hopefully reach out to these people to show my appreciation for them showing up and actually conversing with me during the course of this live stream. But anyway, like I said before, if any one of you have any questions about law, politics, it can be any law, but I feel that the right to keep and bear arms, as that freedom pertains to self-defense, is more prevalent now because that is a freedom that is utilized to protect all other freedoms. So we get that out the way first and understand that we all have a freedom in spite of our past criminal history or whatever history that may be. Then we'll be on the road of becoming more educated on what other rights actually signify, in spite of what we have been misled to believe by those in civil service, primarily because to manipulate us is to fulfill or be in a greater position to fulfill their personal, political, business, financial, and oftentimes spiritual interests or agendas. But I want to take that away from them, y'all. I want to give the power back to the people where it rightfully belongs. And the only way to do that is to convey specific information to you all in hopes to further educate, inspire. And perhaps some of you have even been entertained by this particular live stream to some extent or another. But nevertheless, you all have a good day or night, depending on where you are. And just stay safe out here, y'all. Y'all have a good day. And I'll see y'all on the next one.